These problems are just basic factoring problems, and so you have to try to look at some characteristics of your equation in order to determine what your factors are. Now also recognize that we're trying to find a solution because now we have it equal to 0. So now we're actually going to solve for our value of n in problem number 25, or our values, because we may get 1, we may get 2, or we may get none, but we're not going to have no solutions at this time, no real solutions. Okay, so let's look at number 25. So we know that we have to have 2 factors. Okay, we're going to get 2 factors, and we do know that in order to get n squared, we need n times n. Okay, so we know that, so we can forget about that now. Now we look at this last term here, the negative 40, and we need to be able to find the factors of 40. Okay, so we're going to identify the factors as being 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10, and then 5 and 8. Those are all of the factors of 40. We also need to notice that's in a negative 40. So the only way for it to be a negative, because remember we're multiplying 2 numbers together to get negative 40, one of the numbers has to be a negative and the other has to be a positive. And now we have to recognize that when we multiply the single n's by those numbers, that they need to combine to get to be a plus 3, which tells us that we have to have a difference between any of the factors that we use. The difference has to be 3. So when we look at each one of these sets, so 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 4 and 10, 5 and 8, we have to find the one set that has a difference of 3, and 5 and 8 have a difference of 3. Okay, so now that we've selected the set, we also have to situate the larger number with the same sign as the center term. So the larger number is 8, and the center term has a sign of positive, so we're going to put the positive 8 there, and we'll put the negative 5 over here. Okay, so now when we do our distribution, we should come back up to being this polynomial, and let's just verify that we have our factors right before we move on to the next step. So we're going to multiply the n times the n, and we get n squared. Then we're going to multiply the n times the 8, and we get a plus 8n. Now we're going to use this negative 5. We're going to multiply the negative 5 times the n, which is negative 5n, and then the negative 5 times the positive 8, and we get negative 40. Now we can combine the center terms, and we end up with n squared plus 3n minus 40. So certainly we did come up to the same problem as what we started with, so we know that we have the right factors. Okay, so since we have the right factors, we need to take those factors, and all of this is equal to 0. So what we do know is that if n minus 5 equaled 0, we would have 0 times n plus 8, and that actually equals 0. So that means n minus 5, whenever n minus 5 equals 0, then this whole equation is going to be equal to 0. So if n minus 5 has to equal 0, that means n has to equal 5. Well, we also can see that if we have n minus 5 and we multiply it times 0, we're going to get 0. So that means that n plus 8 can be 0. And so when we say n plus 8 equals 0, then we know that n has to be negative 8. And so therefore our solutions to number 25 would be n equals negative 8 and 5. Those are our two solutions to that problem. Okay, let's do number 27 without so much commentary. So we know that we have to have factors, and so we're going to put our factors here, our parentheses to create those factors, and this whole thing is going to have to equal 0. So we're looking at our constant term, 14, and the factors for 14 are 1 and 14, 2 and 7. Those are our only factors that we have. Okay, we have a subtraction sign, so that means the two factors have to subtract from one another to get us 5. And so our two factors that we're going to use are 2 and 7. So we'll put our 2 and our 7 in there. We know that the signs have to be different because when we multiply two numbers together and we get a negative number, a negative 14, one has to be negative and one has to be positive. We know which one has to be positive because the larger number always is the sign of the center term. So our 7 has to be positive, our 2 has to be negative. To get an a squared, the only way to get an a squared is to have a times a. And so again, we could double check to make sure that we have the right factors, but I'm just going to let you know that yes, indeed, we do have the right factors. Okay, so now that we have our factors, we have to recall that we can set this equal to 0 because 0 times a plus 7 is going to get a 0. So a minus 2 equals 0. That tells us that a is simply 2. And we can do the same thing over here because if a plus 7 is equal to 0, then this whole equation would be 0. And so we have a plus 7 equals 0. And in this case, a equals negative 7. So our solutions to this are a equals negative 7 and 2. Okay, so let's look at this problem because we have a slightly different situation, but we're still going to do the same kind of process. So we have to create our factors. I'm going to set them equal to 0. So this time we have a 12 as our constant. So our factors for 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Okay, it's a positive this time, which means that we're going to have to add our factors together to get 8. So that means our factors are going to have to be 2 and 6. Okay, so now that we have 2 and 6, we know that we have a 2 and 6. We also have to recognize this add just tells us that we have the same signs on both of our numbers. Well, our signs are determined by this sign, the sign of the center term, and so that means that we have to have the same negative sign. So we're going to have a negative 2 and a negative 6. To create the n squared, we're just going to have an n and an n because we multiply those together to get that first term. So again, let's just quickly distribute the n to the n gets us n squared. The n to the negative 6 gets us negative 6n. Then we're going to distribute the negative 2 to the n to get negative 2n, and the negative 2 to the negative 6 to get us, positive 12. And all of that equals 0. And when we combine these two center terms, we have n squared minus 8n plus 12 equals 0, which is exactly what we started with. So we know that these are indeed our factors. So n minus 2 times n minus 6 equals 0. If we set one factor to 0 at a time, we'll find our solutions. So n minus 2 equals 0, so that means n equals 2. And if we set n minus 6 equal to 0, that means n equals 6. So our solutions are n equals 2 and 6. Here's two problems for you to do on your own, number 21 and 23. Stop the video, work both problems, and then when you resume the video, the solutions will be prepared for you. Here are the answers. I hope you got both of them right.